Hey class, it's me again. This is a continuation of our lecture on the Human Rights Instrument and Protection Agenda segment of our course. And so we are going back to Leatherman's book right now. She then talks about in 2011, UN Women was established, which is short for the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. If you looked on that link on Blackboard in our content folder for today, the one that says UN Women with regard to Security Council resolutions, you can click on up at the top where it says about what we do, where we are, how we work, etc., and our partnerships, etc., etc. It gives a really good overview on some of the monumental and really super important work they do addressing violence against women in conflict and in peacetime. So this was really super important. It was established to focus on programming to directly benefit the world's most vulnerable women, not just specifically for conflict-related sexualized violence. And after this, increased funding internationally was given and dedicated for such services. Um, Leatherman starts to talk about later in this book, and this is really super important. We talk quite a bit in this class. The focus is on conflict-related sexualized violence, right? And genocide, conflict, post-conflict, things like that, right? Um, there's a quote on page 173 wherein she says, gendered advocacy must be both moral advocacy and policy advocacy. The moral advocacy has to do with raising awareness about structural forms of violence and the network of power relations that enable sexualized violence and conflict. And we learned about the structural forms of violence that may exist in different societies to the extent and degree to which they exist, how basically sexism is institutionalized in society, how misogyny is operationalized in society, right? And some of these power relations, which we didn't study too much in this class, but on an international level, right? Particularly, there's one chapter where we did not focus too extensively on, but particularly one thing that is super important to understand is that there's still a big challenge today that Leatherman talks about in this chapter about how states' leaderships and their ties to multinational corporations. These multinational corporations and state leaderships, particularly in some countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and some others that are kleptocracies, if you will, but these states will benefit from predatory practices such as exploiting developing states and regions, particularly in the global south, with regard to extraction of resources, producing social harms that result from supply chains that exploit markets, exploit the most vulnerable people in society who are living in dire poverty, engaging in neo-colonial practices, in which violence is of these practices are drivers of conflict, and this disproportionately affects women and girls in particular. In order for these multinational corporations to, make a profit, right? And who benefits from that? It's important to understand who benefits from these sort of things. The answer is us. We as consumers in the West really can make a difference because we sometimes don't understand where our supply chains for certain things come from as some conflict zones, right? With regard to whether it's blood diamonds, whether it's uh, garments that are produced in Bangladesh in abject poverty, right, where people are working in sweatshop positions, particularly underage girls. So it's important to understand where our things come from, right? And so it's important to engage in an ethic of caring. Um, that Leatherman talks about. This would have an emphasis on integrated values of sensitivity, empathy, responsiveness, and taking responsibility. She goes on to say that an ethics of care really can help us determine what sort of boundaries should be set so that people are not exploited and victimized by conflict. It requires us, this ethic of care requires us to think of ourselves as members of a global community. My interests are tied up and relational and interdependent with the interests of an artisanal miner in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a garment worker in Bangladesh. So things like that. It's important to understand. Like we don't live in isolation. We are part of a larger global um, world, right? So my interests are just as important, and they are intertwined and interdependent with the interests of those um, in poverty, right? Or people affected by conflict, right? So this is important to understand, like raising human rights issues and ending violence against women as well as sexualized violence as a weapon of conflict. These are all part of a campaign at ending a culture of neglect under hegemonic constructions of aggressive masculinity that we've seen in Leatherman's book. We've studied throughout, and it's like to bring forth kind of this ethic, this global ethics of caring, which is super important. If we do that, if we adopt it, then we are much more apt to help those that are victimized by conflict-related sexualized violence, right? So the next section of Leatherman's chapter talks about dilemmas of accountability, right? And we talked about this throughout this class about how there's oftentimes difficulty in bringing perpetrators into custody to face charges of sexualized violence and conflict or genocide, particularly the big fish, right? Sometimes that extends to heads of state. The book mentions Omar al-Bashir. He was the former president of Sudan. He had been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and then afterwards crimes of genocide. It is only last year that there was a coup last year in the Sudan. Actually, a part of a popular uprising, right? They basically ousted Omar al-Bashir from power. He was arrested. The interim government that's in power now only recently agreed to hand him over to the International Criminal Court to answer for crimes of genocide that happened while he was a president in Darfur, right? The president of Sudan, for crimes against humanity and genocide that happened in Darfur, right? So if you go onto Blackboard, there's a link with regard to it's an article by the Associated Press, Sudan to hand over al-Bashir, and this became very. This was a monumental, groundbreaking thing. This is a head of state who was charged with genocide while he was sitting head of state, but now he's been deposed, if you will. He's been jailed. Now he's going to hopefully face the Hague, a trial in the Hague, in the Netherlands, where the ICC is headed or based, right? So this is very super promising, particularly for those who suffered genocide in the Darfur states in the western part of Sudan. So this is like so monumental and so important. It's super hard to bring a sitting head of state to task and to bring him to trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Um, the the fact that he's out of power did not really change the calculus until very recently, when the interim government decided that he's going to answer for these crimes, which is such a monumental thing. Hopefully they'll follow up on that. That remains to be seen. However, that's promising, right? So there are tensions with regarding holding perpetrators accountable. International efforts tend to punish the big fish. But what happens when there's like a lot of perpetrators in a conflict, such as in the Rwandan genocide? Ordinary civilians. How do you hold massive amounts of ordinary civilians accountable for engaging in mass atrocities and genocide? They may not have been the actual planners, orchestrators of the genocide, but they still need to be held accountable, particularly for crimes of sexualized violence, right? So there are some other measures that have been done in conjunction with retributive justice measures, such as criminal trials, going to jail and stuff, with more restorative measures. In the context of Rwanda, one measure that is there's a clip of it in our folder for April 7th, with regard to the Gacaca courts, which was a traditional Rwandan form of restorative justice, where basically it's an open outside court, Gacaca meaning on the grass, and the perpetrators stand trial in front of members of the community, and the members of the community say what these people did. And then what happens is these people, their crimes are known to the public. They may go to jail. They may be ordered to do some sort of retributive, or excuse me, some sort of restorative work for the family they victimized, something like that, right? Very important. So other important components are some things such as the Rainbow Centers in Sierra Leone. If you look in our Blackboard page, there's a link about the Rainbow Initiative in Sierra Leone, and these are centers that are dedicated, that are survivor focused, that dedicated on the survivors of sexualized violence during conflict, right? And so this is a very really some of the programming that they do in these centers really helps to focus on healing, restorative justice, accessing justice mechanisms, things like that. It's a holistic sort of approach. And we saw other examples of this with Panzi Hospital in the Democratic Republic of Congo that helped victims of sexualized violence, um, and also healing to some extent, not just from the physical wounds, but from the psychosocial trauma involved. So some other initiatives that are more grassroots and more survivor centered exist as well in different contexts, which are all very important. All these things are very important with regard to protection, helping survivors, etc. So this is a short summary video of, well, part 2 of a short summary video of our materials for today, Tuesday, April 14th. So I thank you very much for your attention, and that's it. And I will speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye.